Good afternoon. I want to thank everybody who joins us. My name is Ola Atamanova, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Ukraine Media Center today. Today we're starting our day with a conversation about the situation in the borders of our country. Joining us in the studio is Andrii Demchenko, spokesperson for the State Bodyguard Service of Ukraine. Good afternoon, Mr. Andrii. Good afternoon, Ms. Olga. So, how about we start our conversation with the hottest sections of our border? What is the situation in what we're now calling the forward edge of the battle area? What is the situation over there? What is the situation in the border with Belarus? Well, let's start with the border with Belarus, because in fact within the latest period there were no significant changes observed in that section of the border, something that would pose a threat to Ukraine, but at the same time that area remains a priority for us because Belarus continues being in the sphere of influence of Russia, and our task is to have strong defense there. And basically all of the components of the security and defense forces of Ukraine, including bodyguard service, National Guard, the armed forces of Ukraine, control the border from Volyn to Chernihiv region. And we continue reinforcing that border on everyday basis. The forward edge of the battle area, as well as the border with Russia, where the representatives of State Bodyguard Service take part in battle operations, remains difficult when it comes to the border with Russia. It can be viewed as the forward edge of the battle area because the terrorist state continues attempting to inflict strikes on Chernihiv, Sumy, and Kharkiv regions along the border, and the biggest number of shellings falls on the Sumy and Kharkiv regions. Also, there is still a threat posed by the sabotage teams of the enemy. However, lately we have not been observing significant increase in such attempts. However, such threats still exist for all of those areas, the three regions of Ukraine. A little bit earlier, such cases were mostly documented in Sumy region. However, both for Kharkiv and Chernihiv region, the attempts of the operations by the sabotage teams of the enemy continues being a threat, and our security and defense forces continue trying to identify and repel such attacks. Along the forward edge of the battle area in Kupiansk, Liman, Kramatorsk areas, the enemy continues shelling the positions of the State Bodyguard Service using different types of weapons, including UAVs. We also continue documenting attempts of storming the positions of our defenders in Liman and Kupiansk areas. At the same time, having more intense capabilities, the representatives of the State Bodyguard Service are capable of repelling such attacks by the enemy. And, for example, within the last week, there were 160 occupiers killed and about 120 destroyed, about 8 tanks and more than 16 other armored vehicles were damaged or destroyed, and the representatives of the State Bodyguard Service continue repelling the attacks of the UAVs such as Shahed, which are extensively used in the southern regions of Ukraine in cooperation with other units of the security and defense forces. More than 30 Shahed drones were downed within just the last day. Mr. Andrii, we know that the residents of Sumy, Chernihiv, and Kharkiv regions are mostly affected by those shellings, by the guided aviation bombs. To what extent does the enemy continue using this type of weapons. And when it comes to the type of weapons, what is the type of weapon mostly extensively used by the enemy? Well, when it comes to the shellings along the border, the enemy mostly uses the artillery, cannon artillery, mortars, and also they quite actively use the strike drones. That's what they use the mostly to inflict damage on our positions. But when it comes to Sumy regions, we also document quite an intense activity of enemy's aviation, who continues inflicting strikes on the areas along the border. I would like to stop at some significant nuance, something that gained significant publicity, a government's initiative to delegate the procurement of defense capabilities to State Bodyguard Service of Ukraine. We've heard a lot of discussions about that. We've seen that the latest publications claim that such resolution was made during the meeting of the Supreme Commander due to the risk of inability to use those funds. So is the State Bodyguard Service capable of processing those funds, and what are the further steps for all of us? Well, this topic was first presented as treason or financial machinations or unfaithful suppliers. It all started going down on the State Bodyguard Service of Ukraine, and in order to debunk that myth, we've provided an explanation about how it's all going. And at the same time, I can add that the State Bodyguard Service, as an integral part of the security and defense forces of Ukraine, has a certificate of the funds user of the second level, and since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, we procure arms and ammunition for the needs of to cover the needs of our units, and having this quantum of trust from our partners, we're getting the lowest price offers. All those bids are provided to the General Staff and the Ministry of Defense, so they could analyze the prices and also take part in such procurement at the lowest prices. And having this quantum of trust, I need to emphasize that is the third resolution this year about the delegation of procurement capabilities to the State Bodyguard Service of Ukraine, and then all those goods can be channeled to other units of security and defense forces of Ukraine, those who are staying in the front line, so they could destroy the enemy more efficiently. Talking about two previous resolutions, those were amounts of 5.8 billion and almost 32 billion for procurement of arms and ammunition. And those resolutions have already came into effect, and basically the shells procured under those contracts are already destroying the enemies. There are 23 more billion in the pipeline, and I hope we are going to cope with it perfectly. We work quite transparently, openly. Our partners with whom the State Bodyguard Service is in contact, they have quantum of trust. For example, a company that was described as the shell company, they have a NATO certificate. They haven't failed a single contract. They've been working with the Ministry of Defense and State Bodyguard Service of Ukraine since 2022, and there was no failure in supply of the goods and products. They have no indebtedness in front of the security and defense forces of Ukraine. That's why we continue working, and we are ready to get involved in procurement, not only for our units, but in case if the Ministry of Defense may provide such a suggestion to have those authorities delegated to the State Bodyguard Service of Ukraine, we would be ready to work in that area 2 to make sure the supplies of weapons and ammunition are uninterrupted for all of the security and defense forces of Ukraine. The Ministry of Defense mentioned that the risk of non-drawing the funds could result in failure to supply the necessary types of ammunition within the first half a year of the next year. So we're understanding it correctly that you have already been doing such procurements in amounts of above 23 billion hryvnia. Absolutely. The claims that the State Bodyguard Service is not entitled to such procurements or have no relevant experience and would not be able to process this amount of funding is the manipulation, basically. So that type of procurement is done for the needs of the State Bodyguard Service of Ukraine or all of the security and defense forces. All those resolutions made by the government to delegate the authorities to the State Bodyguard Service to procure certain types of weapons and ammunition, it is set forth in the resolution of the government that those weapons and ammunition are supposed to come to the security and to the State Bodyguard Service of Ukraine. And the Ministry of Defense is responsible for procurement of ammunition to those units who are armed with mortars, cannon artillery, rocket artillery. So basically the State Bodyguard Service had to reconfigure themselves so they could have relevant equipment and weapons to be able to effectively eliminate the enemy without just observing it from a side, because now the needs to ensure the uninterrupted supply of the ammunition is critical for all of the security and defense forces. And when it comes to the bid offers, I mean the price bids that the State Bodyguard Service receives, there's a lot of controlling agencies in the government of Ukraine which analyze the price policies, and we have to understand that it's not only about the price offers given to the State Bodyguard Service of Ukraine or other agencies. It should all be confirmed with availability of ammunition. There could be even cheaper offers, but the contracts could fail without proper supplies. So our task is to analyze the offers and to find necessary type of ammunition and to make sure there would be no failure of supply and there would be no other violations in the course of such activities. Thank you very much for your comments on this topic. It's really concerning. And now let's talk about the western borders of Ukraine, the migration of our population. What do you observe lately? To what extent the passenger flow from Ukraine has intensified lately, or is it the other way around? Well, now we can analyze the 11th month of this year. Generally, the border was crossed by 32.2 million people in both ways. Comparing it to the same period of the year 23, there is a minor decrease because within the 11th month of the year 23, 32.8 million persons have crossed the border, so basically 500,000 more. At the same time, 32.3 million people who've crossed the border within 11th month of this year. In 28 million of cases, they were the citizens of Ukraine, and in percentage, it's 50-50. 14 million citizens of Ukraine both ways, so there is no domination on part of either citizens leaving Ukraine or entering the country. At the same time, in the month of November, the number of border crossings was about 2.5 million persons in general, and is the same figure as in November last year. But in this year, the number of people crossing the border in November is less than in October. Again, we don't see any significant increase. Like during the autumn months, there was an increase. During summer months, more people were leaving the country, and the total passenger flow, the majority of the total passenger flow falls on the border with Poland. About 18 million people are crossing the border in the checkposts with Poland, both entering and leaving Ukraine. But in the eve of the Christmas and New Year holidays, we're expecting the passenger flow to intensify. For example, the latest weekend was characterized by some intensification of the passenger flow both on Saturday and Sunday. About 100,000 people. For example, more people left on Saturday and more people came back on Sunday, but I think the passenger flow is about to intensify significantly by the following weekend. This is what was happening during the last years. Well, do you see any complications for border crossing by the passengers or cargo transport in the western parts of our border? Well, fortunately not. The movement is quite dynamic in both directions, both those entering and leaving Ukraine. The restrictions for movement of cargo trucks announced by Polish farmers are not happening, and we hope they will not resort to that type of action, because even the previous blocking in the end of November that lasted within a couple of days, and their requirements that they've announced had nothing to do with Ukraine. Talking about other categories of transport, light vehicles, cargo trucks, and just passengers, there are no complications in border crossing. Well, when it comes to violations, we know that you force some of the Ukrainians to go back to Ukraine as they want to cross the border because they don't have necessary documents. So what are the most popular reasons for refusal? Well, talking about 11 months of this year, almost 55,000 Ukrainians were rejected to cross the border. Obviously, the majority of those rejected were the men, the citizens of Ukraine aged 18 to 60 years, because they didn't fall under the conditions to cross the border. Some might have even forgotten their documents. Generally, they fall under these statistics too, and some of them didn't have legal reasons to cross the border. This is why they were rejected. And there is yet another category of citizens who are prohibited to cross the border by the resolutions of the government, but the majority of those who were rejected are the men aged 18 to 60 years. Well, talking about violations, we understand that it's not only about those who didn't have legal reasons to cross the border. There were such who were trying to cross the border in the green section. We see there where the conditions being complicated. What is the dynamics? What is going on with those who try to cross the border in the green section of the border? Well, there is certain dynamics. We continue observing the decrease of attempts of illegal border crossing in the green section, but still there are people who continue attempting to cross the border in illegal way on a daily basis. The majority of such cases is happening in the green section of the border. However, there are cases where people attempt to cross the border in the checkposts, providing either counterfeit documents or they try to falsify the reasons to leave the country, but the number of such people is way, way smaller than those who try to cross the border across the fields and mountains, try to overcome the borderline where in the sections where it goes along the riverbeds, and our task is to identify the schemes, the criminal schemes who brief the people how to better get to the border, how to better cross it, who extort money or promise some assistance in exchange for money. But we have to emphasize that such organizations don't care about the life and health of such people. Their main task is to get richer, and they don't care what happens to their so-called clients, because the weather conditions are currently very unfavorable, and any attempts to cross the border in the legal way in the green section may result in death of the people. We identify a lot of violators who are being, so to say, fished in the river, and basically the State Bodega Service saves their lives. Basically, we've already uncovered 700 of such criminal schemes that involved many persons, including organizers and assistants, including 330 such criminal groups this year only. So we observe the growth of such interest to enrich using such people. Okay, so what is the responsibility for such people, for the violators and the organizers? For the violators is the administrative liability, a penalty. The State Bodega Service representatives draw a protocol, and the court makes a resolution about the liability of such persons. When it comes to the assistance to organization of such schemes, it's already something that entails criminal liability under the Article 332 of the Criminal Code of Ukraine, both for associates and organizers. Also, there is a criminal liability contemplated for those who try to counterfeit documents or falsify their reasons to leave the country. Well, talking about falsification, it's when the men enter a fictive marriage with the women with disability, and the State Bodega Service representatives very thoroughly check the documents of such people, and quite frequently we uncover that the women with disability, they get financial benefit after entering into marriage with such a man, so such a man could cross the border. And for a man, it could entail administrative liability. Meanwhile, for the women, it could be an association in attempt to illegally cross the border. Thank you very much for your answers. And if you have any questions, you may ask them now from the floor. Good afternoon. My name is Stanislav, Suspilne Movlena. What is the situation in the so-called humanitarian passages between Ukraine and Russia, when the citizens of Ukraine who end up in occupation could get to the territory under Ukrainian control without obstacles? Well, first thing, we need to understand that there are no humanitarian corridors in the border with Russia or Belarus, but definitely Ukraine supports the citizens of Ukraine who try to get back to territory under Ukrainian control. For example, the border with Russia. At some area we were documenting that people keep coming from Russia to Ukraine in the Sumy region, in the checkpost of Pokrovka. And definitely, if the citizens of Ukraine were coming to Ukraine, we ensured this option for them, even in case they had no documents. Sometimes people were let in even without documents, but people were undertaking that risk, because when it comes to the potential actions of the enemy, well, we were not in communication with them to find out what they could do. And again, now we don't document any activity in this section of the border. It's most likely that the Russians just refuse to provide such an option even to those citizens of Ukraine who would like to use that option. No single citizen of Ukraine can be restricted in their right to come back home. We're not in contact either with the Russian or Belarusian side, but should it happen that in any checkpost a citizen of Ukraine come to the border of Ukraine, they will be able to come back to Ukraine without being rejected and be brought back to the country they're coming from. And now the majority of such border crossings is going on in the border with Belarus in the checkpost of Domonova. Thank you very much for this conversation. Let me remind you, joining us was Andrii Demchenko, the spokesperson of the State Border Guard Service of Ukraine. And just in a couple of minutes, we're going to talk about the condition of our energy sector. So stay tuned and let's continue working for our victory. Glory to Ukraine.